2 weeks to Christmas, and Mr. Ade's house was a hive of activity. His 3 children were running up and down the hallway, their laughter filling the air as they talked about the upcoming trip to their hometown. They had no idea what awaited them this year. The annual journey to Oko village was a family tradition. It was the only time they got to see their extended family, enjoy the fresh village air, and play under the tall mango trees with their cousins. The kids looked forward to it every year, but this Christmas would be unlike any other, a Christmas marked by darkness and sorrow. Mrs. Ade, whose name was Amara, was busy as always. She packed their bags, sorted out clothes, and fried chin-chin for the long journey. Amara prided herself on her organization, making sure everything was ready days before their departure. Yet, there was one thing she always worried about. Her husband, Ade, never prayed. "Ade, can we take just a minute to pray about this trip?" Amara asked as she tucked their youngest child's clothes into a suitcase. Ade brushed her off with a laugh. "Amara, you worry too much. God knows we're traveling. Do you think he needs a reminder to protect us?" Amara's heart sank. She felt a heaviness she couldn't explain. She turned to him with pleading eyes. "Ade, please. For the sake of the children." Ade waved dismissively and left the room, leaving Amara to mumble a quiet prayer under her breath. The children, oblivious to their mother's concerns, were just as carefree as their father. For them, it was all about the adventure. None of them could foresee the dark shadow waiting in Oko village, one that would change their lives forever. The older children had started mimicking their father. Whenever Amara knelt for her morning prayers, they would sigh loudly and drag their feet, muttering, "Mama, why do we have to pray every day? It's so boring." But no amount of eye-rolling or grumbling stopped Amara from praying. Every morning, she asked God to watch over her family and guide their steps. Yet she couldn't shake the longing for her husband, Ade, to join her, just once. She believed that if they prayed together as a family, it would strengthen their bond and offer divine protection. The house remained lively as the children chattered about what they planned to do in Oko village. Ade laughed as their excitement bubbled over, but Amara sat quietly, watching her family with a heavy heart. She whispered a silent prayer, "Lord, please keep us safe this Christmas." As the days to Christmas dwindled, the family remained blissfully unaware of the danger lurking on their path. Something dark and ominous awaited them, something that would test their faith in ways they couldn't imagine. One evening, as Ade was driving home from work, his thoughts wandered to the journey ahead. He smiled as he imagined the joyful chaos of reuniting with the extended family. Turning a sharp corner, his headlights caught the figure of an old woman standing by the roadside. She was wrapped in a faded Ankara cloth, her basket clutched tightly in one hand as she waved for help. Ade slowed down, rolling his window down to address her. "Mama, where are you heading to?" he asked, his tone polite. The old woman's tired voice replied, "My son, I'm going just down the next street. Can you give me a ride?" Without hesitation, Ade nodded. "Of course, Mama. Get in." He reached over to unlock the door, unaware that this small act of kindness would set events in motion that would forever alter his family's destiny. The old woman climbed into the car, sitting quietly as Ade started driving again. For a while, silence filled the air, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of crickets from the roadside. Finally, the old woman cleared her throat, her voice soft but firm. "My son," she began cautiously, "I hope you won't take offense at what I'm about to say." Ade glanced at her, puzzled but intrigued. "What is it, Mama?" She sighed deeply, as if choosing her words carefully. "This Christmas, you should not travel to your village. And if you must go, you and your family must pray and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead." Her words seemed to hang heavily in the air, filling the car with an eerie stillness. Ade chuckled, breaking the tension. His laugh was loud, almost dismissive. "Mama, you mean I should cancel our Christmas trip? This isn't the first time we've traveled to Oko village, and nothing has ever happened. We'll be fine." The old woman turned her head to look at him, her expression grave. Her dark eyes seemed to pierce through him. "I've said what I came to say. The rest is in your hands, my son." When they reached their destination, Ade slowed the car to a stop. The old woman stepped out, her small basket clutched tightly. Before she walked away, she turned back and fixed him with one last look. "Thank you for the ride," she said solemnly. "But remember my words. Pray and fast if you must go." Ade waved her off, his tone light. Thank you, Mama. Have a good evening. He drove away, shaking his head at the woman's warning. But her words lingered in his mind, like a faint echo that refused to fade. Take care, Ade called out as he drove off. He shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. Why do people always try to scare others with these strange warnings, he thought. He convinced himself the old woman was either overly superstitious or just trying to sound wise. After all, he had driven to Oko village every Christmas without a single problem. This year would be no different. As his car disappeared into the fading light, the old woman remained motionless by the roadside, her face calm and unreadable. Her message had been delivered, and what lay ahead was no longer in her control. It was now 2 days to Christmas, and the Ade household was alive with excitement. Bags were packed and lined up by the front door, stuffed with clothes, gifts, and Amara's carefully prepared snacks for the journey. The children were bursting with energy, running around the house and chattering about seeing their cousins and playing under the mango trees. Amara, as always, was the calm. Ade stepped out of the car, popped the bonnet, and peered at the engine as if it might explain itself. He fiddled with a few wires and tried the ignition again, but the car only gave a weak cough before falling silent. Frustrated, he slammed the bonnet shut and marched back into the house. The car won't start, he announced, scratching his head. I don't know what's wrong with it. Amara looked at him, calm as always. Maybe God doesn't want us to go, she said quietly. Ade's patience snapped. Stop saying that. What does God have to do with a car engine? I'll call the mechanic. The mechanic arrived quickly, his toolbox clinking as he got to work inspecting the car. After a thorough check, he stood up and shook his head. Oga, the engine has knocked. This car isn't moving anywhere until it's repaired. Ade's jaw dropped. Knocked? How? I drove it just yesterday, and it was fine. The mechanic shrugged. Sometimes these things just happen, sir. It's beyond me. Amara gave a faint smile. God knows why, she said, her voice steady. Ade threw up his hands in exasperation. God knows why, he mimicked sarcastically. So what now? Are we just going to stay here and cancel Christmas? Amara said nothing, only watching as Ade paced back and forth like a caged lion. After a moment, he clapped his hands decisively. We'll go to the park and take a commercial bus. It's not ideal, but we'll still get to the village. Amara frowned. Maybe we shouldn't go at all, she said gently. Don't start with that again, Amara, Ade snapped. We're going, and that's final. I've made up my mind. With those final words, Ade ended the discussion. The bags were repacked for the bus, and the children, still buzzing with excitement, got ready for the journey. Amara, however, felt a growing unease. She prayed silently, Lord, take control and protect my family. But far away, someone else's heart was stirring with anger and envy. In a small weathered hut at the edge of the village, Mama Nkechi sat outside, her eyes fixed on the dusty road. Her face was tight with bitterness, and her thoughts churned with resentment. Every year, Ade and his family returned to Oko village like royalty. Their shiny car always turned heads, their well-dressed children full of laughter and stories from the city. Meanwhile, Mama Nkechi's own son struggled. Some couldn't even afford to come home, and when they did, it was on battered bicycles or on foot. Mama Nkechi clenched her fists, her lips curling into a sneer. Why must every Christmas be about Ade? She muttered to herself. Why must they flaunt their riches and make us look like beggars? Her heart boiled with jealousy, and this year she decided things would be different. She summoned her closest confidant, Mama Ifioma, a woman known for her sharp tongue and willingness to scheme. Sister, Nkechi began in a low voice, I can't take this anymore. This year, that man and his family will not come here to humiliate us. Mama Ifioma nodded, her lips curling into a wicked smile. You are right, Nkechi. It's time to put an end to this. Without hesitation, the two women made their way into the forest, heading to the hidden dwelling of the village witches, a place feared and avoided by most. Deep in the shadows of the ancient trees, they planned to set something sinister in motion. The path was dim and eerie, the trees bending low as though they were whispering secrets to the wind. Mama Nkechi and Mama Ifioma trudged forward, their steps hesitant yet resolute. When they reached the witch's hut, a cold gust of wind swept through, making their skin prickle with fear. The leader of the witches, an ancient woman with a face as creased as parched earth, appeared from the shadows. Her eyes burned like embers, and her voice rumbled with an unnatural echo. "Why have you come?" she demanded, her gaze piercing. Mama Nkechi knelt on the cold, hard ground, bowing her head. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "My stepson Ade must not reach this village alive. His success mocks me and my children, and I cannot bear it any longer." The witches erupted into cruel laughter, their cackles slicing through the night like shards of glass. "Is that all?" The leader sneered, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Consider it done." They gathered around a bubbling pot of thick, black liquid that gave off an acrid smell. One of the witches tossed in a scrap of cloth Mama Nkechi had brought, a piece of aged shirt from his last visit. Another sprinkled ashes into the pot, her lips moving in an incantation that made the air ripple with unease. The leader raised a skeletal hand, and the room fell silent. "They will not reach this village alive," she declared, her voice icy and final. "A deadly accident awaits them on the road." Mama Nkechi's heart swelled with a dark, twisted satisfaction. She handed over a small bag of coins as payment, and the witches laughed wickedly as they completed the curse. "It is done," the leader said, her tone cold and resolute. That night, as Mama Nkechi returned home, her face was calm, but her heart danced with malicious glee. She could almost hear the cries of her stepson's family, and for the first time in years, she felt powerful. Little did she know, she had set forces in motion that even she could not control. She could already picture it. Ade's bus overturned, his family gone, and the villagers mourning their loss. Finally, her sons would no longer live in his shadow. Back in the city, early the next morning, Ade and his family arrived at the bustling motor park. The place buzzed with activity, hawkers shouting and selling bread, sachets of water, roasted corn, and fruits. The children clung to their bags, their excitement bubbling over as they watched luggage being loaded onto buses and passengers haggling for seats. Ade, holding their tickets, led his family toward the bus. It wasn't as comfortable as their car, but it would get them to the village. They squeezed into their seats, the children pressing their faces to the windows as they giggled and pointed at the chaos outside. Amara's voice broke through the chatter. "Before we start this journey, let us pray," she said, standing and glancing around the bus. Some passengers nodded, closing their eyes, while others whispered among themselves or pretended not to hear. Ade's face turned red with embarrassment. "Amara, sit down," he hissed under his breath. "This is public transport, not church. You're embarrassing me." But Amara wasn't moved. She closed her eyes, her voice steady and resolute. "Lord, we ask for your protection on this journey. Cover this bus and everyone inside it with your mercy. Keep us safe from all harm. Amen." A few passengers murmured a quiet amen, while others rolled their eyes or smirked. Ade shook his head in frustration, muttering, "She'll never change." The bus roared to life and began its journey, the city fading into the background as they drove into the open road. The children chattered excitedly, pointing out sights along the way, trees, hills, and clusters of roadside vendors. Amara sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her prayer had been simple, but she felt a weight lift from her heart. Little did she know, her plea for protection had set unseen forces into motion. Forces that would soon clash with the darkness waiting ahead. Ade, feeling the gentle sway of the bus, leaned his head against the window and drifted off to sleep. For a while, the journey was peaceful. The road stretched out before them, and the steady hum of the engine created a calming rhythm. But as they neared the halfway point of the journey, the calm shattered. The driver's voice cut through the quiet. "The brakes. The brakes aren't working," he shouted, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Panic erupted in the bus. Passengers screamed as the vehicle swerved wildly, veering from one side of the road to the other. Amara grabbed her children, holding them tightly, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Ahead, a massive tanker truck loomed, its size threatening to block the entire road. The driver fought desperately to regain control, but it was too late. The bus sped uncontrollably toward the tanker, the screech of the tires mingling with the cries of the terrified passengers. In those final moments, time seemed to slow. Amara's voice cut through the chaos, crying out, "Lord, save us." But then, with a deafening crash, the bus collided with the tanker. Metal twisted and groaned, glass shattered in every direction, and the world fell silent. For a moment, it was as if everything had stopped. Far away in the village, the wind whispered the news of the crash, carrying the news to eager ears. But what no one knew yet was who had survived. The darkness that had been waiting, it seemed, was not yet done with them. News of the accident spread like wildfire, racing through the village with the wind. Before the sun had set, it reached Ade's village, where people gathered in small clusters, murmuring and shaking their heads. "Did you hear? Ade and his family were in a terrible accident," they whispered, their faces grim. Mama Nkechi heard the news too. She collapsed to the ground, wailing loudly as she tore at her clothes, her heart pretending to break in sorrow. "Oh, my son, my stepchildren, what have we done to deserve this?" she cried, her voice carrying through the village. But deep inside her, a cruel joy flickered. She thought her plan had worked. Now, no one would overshadow her sons, she thought. Her tears were nothing but a mask for the satisfaction that bubbled within. At the crash site, help arrived at last. Amid the twisted wreckage, Amara and her children were found, shaken but untouched. Not a single scratch or bruise marred their skin. It was as if an unseen hand had protected them, shielding them from the danger that had consumed the bus. Ade, however, had not been so fortunate. He had been sitting in the front seat, and the violent impact of the crash had crushed his legs. Though he was still alive, he was left without them. The rescuers rushed him to the hospital, with Amara and the children following close behind, their hearts heavy with a mix of fear and relief. At the hospital, Amara knelt beside her husband's bed, her children huddled around her. Her tears streamed down her face as she whispered a prayer. "Lord, you saved us from the accident. Please don't take my husband. Let him live." The doctors worked through the night, performing surgeries to save Ade's life. By morning, he woke up, weak but alive. The news of his survival spread like a quiet wave across the village, and Amara's heart swelled with gratitude. But little did she know, the darkness that had been set in motion was far from over. Later that day, the old woman that Ade had helped walked into his hospital room. Her steps were slow, yet her presence filled the room with a quiet strength. She stood by his bedside, her eyes full of understanding, as though she knew everything that had happened. "Do you remember me?" she asked softly. Ade nodded weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Mama." The old woman sat down beside him, her gaze unwavering. "I warned you," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "I told you not to travel to the village this Christmas. I told you to pray and fast, but you didn't listen." She shook her head, her voice growing serious. "If not for your wife Amara's prayers, you and your children would be gone by now." Tears filled Ade's eyes as he looked at Amara, who stood silently by his side, her hands clasped tightly together. The old woman continued, "Your stepmother Mama Nkechi and the village witches planned this evil. They cursed you, but God is greater than their plans. It was your wife's prayers that shielded your family," she said, her voice warm with assurance. Overcome with emotion, Ade's tears flowed freely. "I was foolish," he whispered. "I didn't listen. I didn't pray." The old woman placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch comforting yet strong. "Let this be a lesson to you," she said. "Never underestimate the power of prayer. Never ignore the warnings of God." From that day on, Ade was a changed man. Once he was discharged from the hospital, he embraced a new life. Every morning, he was the first to gather his family for prayer, kneeling beside Amara and thanking God for his mercy. On Sundays, Ade was always the first to arrive at church, his voice rising in worship with a newfound passion. As for the village, he never returned for Christmas again. The memory of the crash and the betrayal by his stepmother kept him away. But more than that, it was the lesson learned, the power of prayer, that changed his path forever. It wasn't until years later, after Mama Nkechi passed away, that Ade finally visited the village again. This time, he came with a humble heart and a spirit full of gratitude. The story of his accident and miraculous survival had spread through the village, becoming a lesson for many. It served as a powerful reminder that prayer is the strongest shield against unseen dangers, and that not everyone will rejoice in your success. The villagers, who had once admired his wealth, now looked at him with a new respect. They had witnessed the power of prayer and the protection it brought. Ade's story became one of caution, of humility, and of the importance of listening to the wisdom of others. I hope you found something meaningful in this story. Ade's voice echoed through the years. If you did, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment sharing what you learned, and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. Thank you for listening.